And we're good to go. Thanks for joining, everybody. And I am super excited to announce the next talk here at the Tenbound Sales Development Conference. We have Mr. Justin Roff-Marsh, the author of one of my favorite books on go-to-market strategy. If you have not read this, you need to pick this up. This will absolutely blow your mind. And I have the man himself here. Justin, thank you so much for coming to the conference today and sharing your wisdom. We're excited to talk to you.
Well, it's nice to be here. I hope I have enough wisdom to satiate everyone's curiosity. So I'm good to go, David?
Yeah, take it away. Thank you so much.
Let's do it. So what I want to do is to drop some fairly controversial assertions on you all, and hopefully that will generate enough questions in the Q&A or comments in the chat for us to make this a little bit interactive. I'll see how we go. So I want to start off with a couple of radical claims, and then build on those radical claims by outlining the approach that we bring to growing sales in the organizations that we work with. Before we kick off, I just want to make it clear, I'm pretty sure there are a lot of tech companies, probably specifically SaaS organizations, and although we've worked with some of the larger technology companies, the tech space is not our specialty. Our specialty is working with industrial companies in Middle America. And if somebody wants to ask me why we specialize in that rather than technology companies, there are good reasons. Not necessarily reasons everyone's going to like, but there are good reasons. So let me dive right in. So I said I'll start with a couple of assertions. My belief is there are two default assumptions upon which the design of the traditional sales function is built. And even the modern sales function that you see in Silicon Valley, that's built on these assumptions too. And the problem with these assumptions is that they're incorrect. And the bigger problem with these assumptions is that they are obviously incorrect. And that's what bothers me the most. It's not the truth status of these, it's the fact that these two assumptions are obviously wrong. But in spite of that, most all sales processes are designed and managed, built based upon these assumptions. So the first is that salespeople should be responsible for revenue. I want to argue that they shouldn't be, and that they clearly shouldn't be. And here's how the argument goes. I want to point you to a couple of observations, and I think it's going to become obvious that these observations invalidate this assumption. So the first observation is that if you look at pretty much any organization, the exception would be project organizations, but pretty much any organization in any reporting period, you'll find that most revenue does not come directly from salespeople. It comes from existing customers repurchasing. Now, by most revenue, I mean 70 to 90% of revenue in most organizations that we interact with comes from existing customers repurchasing, not directly from the activities of salespeople. Now, if you point salespeople towards this observation, they will jump to their own defense by claiming that, well, they may not be directly responsible for those dollars, those revenue dollars, but they're indirectly responsible because they are managing the customer accounts. Well, that may be the case, but that's assuming there's a causal connection between their management of the accounts and your retention of those accounts. And it's easy to validate that assumption. All we have to do is to determine why those accounts that leave. In my experience, there are three reasons why accounts leave. In other words, defect and go to organizations' competitors. And they're pretty much the same in most, or not all, but most organizations. And these three reasons lead the other reasons by a country mile. So the number one reason why customers tend to defect, or accounts tend to defect, is poor on-time delivery performance on behalf of the vendor. And you could generalize this by saying poor operational performance, or failing to keep its promises, the vendor that is. The second reason why customers leave is they're unhappy with the organization's pricing. Too damn expensive, in other words. And the third reason why customers leave is that they're not happy with the product. Either they don't like the attributes of the product doesn't actually work, or work according to the salesperson's promises, or they're not happy with the range of products in the case of a multi-line vendor. But they're the top 3 reasons, and the interesting thing about those top 3 reasons is that salespeople are not directly responsible for any of those reasons. So we end up having to draw the conclusion that salespeople aren't responsible for most of the revenue that's generated during any reporting period, and it's hard to claim that they're responsible for retention, because when we look at the accounts that defected during any reporting period, we end up discovering that they defected for reasons other than dissatisfaction with the salesperson. More specifically, they defected because they weren't happy with factors for which operations is primarily and clearly responsible, pricing, operational performance, and product. So the inevitable conclusion is that operations, not salespeople, should be responsible for revenue. Operations should be responsible for revenue. I would go one step further, or I would be a little more specific than that. I would say that operations in your organization should be responsible for retaining accounts that are delivered to them by salespeople. But I'd also claim that operations should be responsible for the incremental growth of accounts, not sales. And to explain the reason for that, I want to use a grocery example. In California, I buy grocery at Ralph's. If you're in Texas, it's probably H-E-B, and different locations elsewhere. But if I discover that I like carrots in the fruit and veg section of Ralph's, I probably don't need a salesperson to interrupt me and suggest that I try Brussels sprouts. If I have a good carrot experience, I probably will of my own volition experiment with Brussels sprouts. And of course, the more good experiences I have within the fruit and veg section, the more likely it is that I purchase all of my fruit and veg requirements in that section of the grocery store. Now, it might be necessary for somebody to prompt me to test out the meat and fish section. But it's certainly not necessary for somebody to prompt me to expand my consumption within a category from which I'm already consuming. In my experience, primarily in industrial, but in other sectors too, and this certainly applies to technology, we have experience there, is that customers, if they're happy with your performance, will automatically buy products from the same category. So operations should be responsible for revenue, both the retention of it and the incremental growth of it. The conclusion, or the corollary of that, is that there's no way of avoiding the conclusion that salespeople cannot be responsible for revenue, and therefore they must be responsible for growth. Now, I'm sure there's folks listening jumping up and down saying, well, you're splitting hairs. Growth and revenue are the same thing because growth results in revenue. When we're talking about growth, obviously we're talking about new accounts, and we're talking about new categories of business for existing accounts. But to claim that new accounts and new categories of business for existing accounts results in revenue is to grossly undervalue new business. What's significant about new business is not the revenue that's generated during the reporting period in which it's won, but the lifetime value, or the value of the annuity that each of those new pieces of business represents. So if anyone knows how to do an NP, net present value calculation, I'm sure you all do, you would know that if an organization has good fundamentals, it's likely that the net present value of the annuity that a new account represents, or a new category of business represents, is probably at least an order of magnitude greater than the revenue value or the transactional value of generated during the first reporting period. So my claim is that operations should be held accountable for revenue, and sales should be held accountable exclusively for the net present value of new business won, and they should have zero responsibility for revenue. Now, the consequence of this is that we need to restructure somewhat so that our operations department understand what their responsibility is and is resourced in such a way as to discharge that responsibility. It also means that we need to narrow the focus of our sales department so that those folks focus exclusively on winning new business and have absolutely nothing to do with retention and absolutely nothing to do with incremental growth. And if you want to grow your organization aggressively, in my experience, that's exactly what you need to do. The second false assumption upon which sales functions tend to be designed is that sales opportunities are scarce. The assumption that sales opportunities are scarce leads to the quest to a quest for the maximization of win rates or conversion rates, as salespeople are wont to call them. The reality is, and I'll explain why in a second, that in almost every environment, assuming an organization has decent fundamentals, is that sales opportunities are not scarce, they're bountiful. They never have been scarce and they never will be scarce. And we should not be designing and optimizing the sales function so as to maximize win rates or conversion rates. We should be designing the sales function so as to maximize the size of the bags of money that your finance folks drag off to the bank at the end of each working day. So how can I make this claim? Well, I'd like to introduce you to a heuristic that we all find enormously useful here at Ballistics. When we're sorting transactions into two useful categories, we talk about transactions that are yours to lose and those that are yours to win. And the ones that are yours to lose, or the implication of the term yours to lose, is that these are transactions that represent, figuratively of course, prospects walking towards you or customers walking towards you waving $100 bills. All you have to do to bank those $100 bills is not screw up. So if you were a cashier at Banana Republic and a customer's walking towards you with an armload full of clothing, that's a yours to lose transaction. Now, presumably, given our discussion of revenue, you would not want salespeople involved in those transactions at all, particularly when you consider that salespeople's superpower is persuasion. If someone's walking towards you trying to give you money, you should not be attempting to persuade them of anything. You should simply be grabbing that money. The last thing that we would want to do is expose people who are trying to give us money to salespeople. The other class of transactions are what we call yours to win transactions. Now, the interesting thing about yours to win transactions is that those prospects are walking around with $100 bills. The problem is that they're walking towards your competitors trying to give them $100 bills. And really, what we want salespeople to do, I hope, is to interrupt those prospects and convince them to give your organization those $100 bills rather than your competitors' organizations. So this is pretty fundamental, and this is obviously what we mean when we talk about winning new business. Now, what's the relationship between that observation and the scarcity of opportunities? Well, it's very, very simple. A sales opportunity is a competitor. Or to be more specific, a sales opportunity is a competitor's customer. So in order to claim that sales opportunities are scarce, your sales department must be able to justify that if we count up all of your competitors' customers, the total number is small enough so as to be insufficient to keep your sales team busy. And if that's the case, you've either grossly overpopulated your sales team or your business has very poor fundamentals and you should probably be exiting it before the market or before your investors find out. You should probably be pivoting. So the reality is, for most organizations, if you count up all of your competitors' customers, you will end up discovering that that number is a big number. If you multiply that number by the number of selling conversations that are required in order to prosecute a sales opportunity, and then you take that number, which is almost certainly a very large number, and divide it by the capacity of an average salesperson to have selling conversations, you will end up discovering that opportunities are not scarce. They've never been scarce, and they never will be scarce. You don't have a problem with opportunity scarcity. You have a problem with salespeople being generally unwilling to pick up the phone and talk to strangers. And that's the problem that you need to be resolving. And there's two ways to resolve that problem. The first thing that you have to do is you have to remove from salespeople all distractions that provide them with an excuse not to be having what I call selling conversations. And selling conversations are conversations performed in pursuit of new business, not conversations performed to manage accounts, because of course, remember, the management accounts is no longer a responsibility of sales. It's not a conversation performed in order to identify a sales opportunity, because as we get to in a minute, why on earth would we have salespeople responsible for trying to identify opportunities in the first place? We don't want that for two reasons. Number one, it's not that hard to identify sales opportunities. All we need to do is build lists of our competitors' customers. And the second reason is most of the information that we're looking for is in the public domain and can be harvested by a marketing department. So there are two false assumptions. Both of these impact negatively on how we go about designing and how we go about managing sales functions. So I want to talk now a little bit before we open this up for questions about, well, what are we going to do about this? So when we work with an organization, and I should let you know that when we work with an organization, it's always because an organization wants to grow aggressively. Sometimes it's because the CEO is particularly entrepreneurial, or oftentimes it's because they've been purchased by a private equity firm and the CEO doesn't have a choice other than, they've developed a sudden desire to grow the organization suddenly. So rapidly, I mean. So if we're introduced to an organization, we bring 3 directives to the table. Now, these directives are not necessarily popular, but it's my assertion that if you want to grow a traditional organization aggressively, these 3 directives are very important. And it's very important that you take these directives literally, not figuratively. The difference between folks who read the book and apply it themselves and our own organization, if we're commissioned to go and do this stuff for our clients' organizations, is folks who read the book take these directives figuratively. The only difference is we take them literally. So directive number 1, we're going to restructure the organization so that salespeople sell and nothing else. And by sell, I mean have or perform selling conversations, remembering that a selling conversation is only a conversation performed in pursuit of new business. So we're going to restructure the organization so that salespeople spend 100% of their available working hours having conversations or selling conversations purely in pursuit of new business, and they do absolutely nothing else. No account management, no solution design, no proposal generation, no tweaking, no blogging, no attendance of trade shows, nothing else. Selling conversations all day long. If they don't like that idea, they probably shouldn't be in sales. Now, the challenge with this has nothing to do with salespeople. Most salespeople are good at persuasion and consequently enjoy persuading other folks of stuff. And they will relish an environment in which they can dedicate 100% of their time to it, just like a welder in a manufacturing environment will relish an environment where they can spend all day welding. Or a brain surgeon will relish an environment that enables them to spend all day poking around in other people's heads. This is not a revolutionary concept. The challenge is that we need to restructure the organization quite significantly so as to make this possible. In fact, you will discover if you go down this route that if you look at the total quantum of effort that's required to achieve this directive, some 80% of that effort needs to be deployed in the functions adjacent to the sales function and only about 20% within the sales function itself. In practice, if you clear the decks for your salespeople so that there is nothing for them to do during working hours other than have selling conversations, then you will find that most salespeople will spend all day having selling conversations, and the folks who aren't comfortable with that will quickly exit the sales team. The second directive is to move most, and by most I mean practically all, and by practically all I mean exactly all sales activities inside. Now, this is not controversial for technology companies, but it is for every other company. And I think because a lot of you are technology companies or most familiar with kind of the Silicon Valley approach to sales, I'm not going to dwell on it. The bottom line is that when we look at sales activities, we discover that most sales activities are already performed inside, in spite of the fact that salespeople argue that they're not, simply because you can't start a conversation in the field. The days are gone where a salesperson can venture out into the field like the opening scenes of The Founder, for those of you who've seen that movie, and drive from location to location trying to start conversations or sneaking in through the back door of organizations. Nowadays, if you want to get face-to-face, you need to spend time on the telephone first, and it turns out you need to spend a lot of time on the telephone. Now, if we look at the reasons why prospects allow salespeople to visit them, for the most part, what we end up discovering is the reason why prospects invite salespeople into their offices or places of work on the small number of occasions that they do, on the increasingly small number of occasions that they do, is for technical reasons, not sales reasons. So we split conversations that occur within the opportunity management process into commercial conversations and technical conversations, and it turns out that almost all commercial selling conversations can and should be done inside. I say should because it's your prospect's preference. The activities that need to be performed face-to-face consist of things like demonstrations, detailed requirement discovery, commissioning, and the like, and salespeople, as we've already discussed, should not be responsible for any of those things. So your salespeople should be inside, and to the extent that field visits are required, you should be sending application engineers or appropriately qualified individuals to perform discrete field activities, albeit activities that nest under the opportunity, which is owned by the internal salesperson. So the last directive is we're going to eliminate salespeople's autonomy and their commissions. And the reason we're going to do that is not because we expect a performance improvement from eliminating salespeople's autonomy and getting rid of the risk-based comp plan, even though we do expect a performance improvement. The reason for the third directive is we know from experience that we cannot execute the first two directives unless we start with the third. We cannot restructure the organization in such a way that salespeople do nothing but selling conversations unless we first take away their autonomy. And to take away their autonomy, we need to take away their commissions. And similarly, we can't execute on the second directive. Similarly, we can't execute on the second directive without taking away salespeople's autonomy and their commissions. Now, I should stress, when we talk about taking away salespeople's commissions, we're not talking about paying them less. We're talking about taking away salespeople's commissions so that we can radically restructure the environment in which they operate, causing them to become significantly more productive than they are currently. Of course, that gives us the freedom to pay salespeople more, significantly more in some cases, than we are paying them currently. But we want to decouple salespeople's income, or only loosely couple salespeople's income to their output, which shouldn't be a radical notion because that's exactly how we pay everyone else in the organization. For those of you who are technology companies, if I came into one of your development teams and talked to your CTO or your VP of engineering and suggested that we put all of your developers on a variable comp plan and paid them a commission based upon numbers of lines of code submitted or features released or something else, you'd throw me off a top floor window. You'd conclude in about 8 seconds that I was an idiot. And it's my contention that paying salespeople commission in the type of environment that I'm describing here is so idiotic that hopefully none of you would even think to attempt to do so. What we're talking about, obviously, for those of you who haven't realized, is applying division of labor to the sales function so that salespeople focus exclusively on that one activity that they're uniquely qualified to perform and nothing else. Now, this is the point where I want to open the floor to questions, and I see there's a couple here, and there are a couple of points that I want to make sure that I touch on because they were in the blurb promoting this session, so I don't want to leave you without discussing them. Derek says, I'm seeing a trend of cutting off upsell opportunities with this approach. Sure, because for two reasons. Because as I said before, if you focus on having excellent operations, your customers will expand their consumption from within categories in which they're currently purchasing automatically. Now, the irony here is by leaving salespeople involved in the management of customer relationships, salespeople end up interfering with operational efficiency. So I have a saying, and everyone hates it, but I love it, so I'll share it with you. And that is that in a transactional environment, customers need a personal relationship with salespeople only to the extent that the organization is operationally dysfunctional. I'll say that again. In a transactional environment, now bear in mind, even a big ticket sales environment, once you have a customer, after a period of time, your relationship with a customer becomes transactional. So bear that in mind. In a transactional environment, customers need a personal relationship with a salesperson only to the extent that the vendor's organizational is operationally dysfunctional. Now guess what? If you allow salespeople to maintain a personal relationship, which basically means inserting themselves into the day-to-day transaction flow when their involvement is not strictly necessary, what will end up happening is that salespeople will actually make a contribution to operational dysfunction. In other words, you end up in an ironic situation where salespeople need to be involved in customer relationships so as to solve the operational dysfunction problems for which they are responsible. And it's not hard to look around an organization and validate that. So yeah, we don't want salespeople involved in existing accounts, and that means we don't want them involved in upselling. We want them involved in selling new categories of business. Should salespeople spend time on personal brand building? If you're a competitor of mine, I would say yes, because I would enjoy seeing you waste your money on your salespeople's effort. No. Is there value in doing that? Yes. But if you're trying to grow your organization aggressively, you will have deliberately designed your organization or your organization as a whole so that your salespeople are the constraint. In other words, for those of you who've read The Goal, what that means is you are deliberately managing your organization so as to keep your sales team fully activated and so as to maintain sufficient protective capacity elsewhere to A, keep the salespeople busy, and B, to process all of the output that salespeople generate. Now, if your salespeople are fully activated, that means that every activity that they perform other than a selling conversation is an activity that's performed at the expense of a selling conversation. So let me put it to you. Do you really think that an hour invested in personal brand building, whatever the hell that is, will produce a better return on your salespeople's time than an hour invested in performing selling conversations? If your answer to that question is yes, you should shut your business down because there's something seriously wrong with your fundamentals. If your constraint is not in sales, your constraint is production, you might want salespeople to slow down and sell a little bit less. And you might choose to deliberately allow salespeople to perform less productive activities so as to take the pressure off production, so as to avoid building a backlog so large that production doesn't process it. But I'm assuming here that folks in this discussion are interested in growing their organizations aggressively, and that requires that you keep the constraint in sales. So that's a long way of saying, no, they shouldn't be spending time on personal brand building or anything else like that. Let me go to Q&A. I think there's... most SaaS companies have their teams broken out as SDR and A. How do I look at it? I look at it as ridiculous, just like the brand building suggestion. The reason let me start by pointing to a situation in which it makes sense to have SDRs. Let's assume that you've invented a new product and everyone in the market wants to buy it, and you have limited capacity to onboard customers, and you have therefore a requirement for crowd control. If you have a requirement for crowd control, what that means is you're going to put some velvet ropes, figuratively speaking, out the front of your facility, and you're going to have some individuals guarding the door, and you're not going to be that concerned with the intellectual capacity of the folks guarding the door. So if you're in a situation like maybe Salesforce was at some point in their history, where there's a requirement for crowd control, or what marketing and sales folks like to call qualification, I don't have a problem with the idea that we're going to have some lesser skilled salespeople, in scare quotes, who are performing the function of crowd control. However, if you don't have a crowd control problem, what you need to ensure is that the first selling conversation that is performed with each prospect is performed by a competent salesperson as opposed to a less than competent salesperson. And there's a very simple reason for that. And that's that the nature of opportunity management is that we're talking about a linear flow of activities. What that means is if you fail to do a good job of activity number one, you don't actually get to activity number two. So in order to have a discovery conversation, or whatever activity two is, you need to make sure that the person who performs the activity prior to the discovery conversation, maybe it's an initial briefing, is a high caliber individual who can have an intelligent conversation, ask sensible questions, quickly come to an understanding of the dynamics of the prospect's environment. And if your SDR was capable of doing that, you wouldn't call them an SDR in the first place, you'd call them an account executive. So there is a situation where SDRs make sense, but it is not the situation in which most organizations that are adding SDRs are adding them. So that raises an interesting question, and that is, well, why are all these organizations adding SDRs? Well, the reason is that their account executive's time is very, very scarce. That raises another question. Why is AE's time scarce? And the reason for it is that account executives are spending most of their available selling hours not selling. Why is that? Because AEs are responsible for account management, which includes upselling, solution design, generation proposal, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Okay. If we apply directive number one and simplify the role of AEs so that the only thing they do is selling conversations, nothing else, no prospecting, no solution design, no proposal generation, no account management, nothing. What you will end up discovering is you have abundant capacity in your AE team, and your AE team won't need lower caliber salespeople performing those initial appointments for them. Now, I talked about conversion rates before and the folly of optimizing for conversion rates. Here's a perfect example. I've seen numerous organizations add SDRs and treat the addition of SDRs as a success because their AE's productivity went up. In other words, their account executives' conversion rate was improved. The only problem with that is you don't actually bank conversion rates. This may be difficult for some of you to hear. You don't actually bank conversion rates. You actually bank dollars, whole dollars, absolute dollars. So we shouldn't be measuring productivity based upon, we shouldn't be measuring productivity at the AE level. We should be measuring productivity across the sales function as a whole. So what ends up happening is when you add AEs, you sub-optimize. When you add SDRs, is you sub-optimize the AE at the expense of the sales function as a whole. Because, and this should not be that surprising for anyone, because high caliber, high net worth, intelligent prospects do not enjoy talking to pimple-faced 22-year-old nincompoops. Now, I'm exaggerating, of course. Not all SDRs have pimples. And probably not all of them are nincompoops. But you can't argue with the fact that SDRs, in terms of sales capability, have a lower level of skills than AEs. Because if they didn't, you wouldn't call them SDRs, would you? You'd call them AEs. So, it depends what you're trying to achieve. It depends what you get paid to optimize. If you're a director of sales and you get paid for optimizing the productivity of AEs, it may appear to make perfect sense. But if you're a member of the senior executive team and you're interested in EBITDA, I don't think there's a strong argument for SDRs unless you're in the enviable situation where your sales function reduces to basic crowd control. How are we going for time, David? I feel like we're probably out of time. I'm happy to keep going though.
Oh, I love it. I feel like we're just getting started. We can do a few more minutes if you can. We did get a couple more questions.
Let me just answer the questions that are here, and then we'll call it a wrap. Using the bag of $100 bills, if the average is one bag walking in, but we need to get that average up to 2 bags, do we still not have salespeople talking to that person? No. No. So if a prospect is walking in with one bag, what we should do is grab that bag and bank it. Okay. And then we should have a sales manager along with a sales manager along with a representative from your marketing team and maybe a representative from the executive team in what we would call a monthly campaign planning meeting. And you could think of a campaign planning meeting as kind of like a war room, a battlefield command type situation. And really the reason for what we call a campaign planning meeting is we want to determine how to apply the limited capacity of your sales team. And the reason that's a critical consideration is because all of our clients deliberately run their organization so that the sales function is the constraint, meaning that every decision that we make about the allocation of work to salespeople involves a trade-off. In other words, if we ask them to do A, they're doing A at the expense of B. So in a campaign planning meeting, what we're trying to decide is, well, what opportunity types, if we push them to salespeople, will maximize the yield on salespeople's limited capacity. So what we do is if somebody walks up with 2 bags of money, we grab the one bag and we bank it. And then we figure out how to indicate in our information system that there is that additional potential. It might be that somebody spotted the extra bag, or it might be that we collected some data on the organization that caused us to allocate them to a category of prospects or category of existing customers that we know have a lot of upside potential. And then what happens is we have a campaign or a number of campaigns in our stable of campaigns that are designed to target those accounts that have that additional potential. Now, it's not upsell potential, it's cross-sell potential. In other words, if somebody bought carrots and we know they have the potential to buy Brussels sprouts, we're not going to give that to salespeople because obviously anyone who buys carrots has the potential to buy Brussels sprouts, and we're going to trust operations to do a good job of delivering the carrots. But if somebody comes in and they purchase something, it becomes apparent to us that they belong to a category of people who have the potential to buy from another product category or service category, then they should automatically be added to the campaign list for that other opportunity. And when we accrue enough contacts in that campaign list, the sales team should be running a campaign specifically designed to cross-sell folks who have bought from category 1 and convince them to buy from category 2. So all that is being controlled at the marketing level. In our world, salespeople never generate opportunities. In our world, the marketing team, or a subset of the marketing team, what we call promotions, generates salespeople's opportunities and pushes them to them. We never build a sales environment where salespeople are responsible for looking around, trying to figure out who to talk to. That's too important a decision to have salespeople make it individually. And not only is it too important a decision, it's a decision that requires access to data and access to the ability to manipulate that data that salespeople simply don't have. In other words, they don't have the context that's required in order to make that decision correctly. So the selection of opportunities that salespeople are pursuing is a decision that's made by your campaign committee. And the campaign committee in our clients' organizations includes senior representatives from sales, from marketing, from product, and oftentimes senior executives from the organization as a whole. So I've covered a lot of ground with that answer. What else have we got? Oh, there's how do you feel about research on account targets who are probable good fit effort to get them to take a meeting? I'm not sure I know what that research is. We're not interested in setting meetings. We're interested in setting, well, if by a meeting you mean a Zoom meeting, that's fine. I'm not interested, I just answered it. I'm not that interested in research, to be honest, because I think most research that I see is measuring people's attitudes or people's perceptions about how they will behave in a given circumstance. I'm not interested in that. I'd rather run an experiment and gather actual behavioral data and use that behavioral data to make decisions moving forward. I think in a lot of cases, this research is a waste of time and effort. Done by people who don't understand stats for the consumption of people who don't understand stats, or who do, but for whom it makes sense to pretend not to. No, SDRs are not the solution to the AE time problem. The solution is a complete organizational redesign. We want the marketing team to understand that they need to push opportunities to salespeople on an as-needed basis, just like a just-in-time manufacturing process. Imagine when you go to a website and order a Dell computer, you all know how that order generates, upline purchase orders to suppliers in real time. That's exactly how the relationship between the sales department and the marketing department works. A salesperson closing an opportunity should send a signal upstream to your marketing department to replenish that opportunity tomorrow. All of our clients' marketing departments replenish salespeople's opportunity queues at the start of every single day. That means if you're a salesperson and you start off with 90 opportunities in queue on Monday, you finish Monday with 85 opportunities in queue. Tuesday morning, before that salesperson gets to work, the promotions department has pushed 5 new opportunities to the salesperson's queue, replenished the salesperson's queue, and sent a pre-approach email on behalf of the salesperson that appears to have come from that salesperson, preempting the call that the salesperson is going to make to the prospect when they get to work later that morning. That's the basic process. It's very simple, it's very low tech, but if you want to grow an organization aggressively, it's a much better approach. I think I've answered everything.
I think so too. Justin, you did not disappoint, and again, I would highly recommend, if folks have not read this is a tremendous summation of Justin's philosophy on go-to-market organization, and we're just scratching the surface. So I would highly recommend getting in touch with Justin to learn more about how to really structure your sales team for high performance. Thank you so much for coming on.
Hey, thanks for having me, David. Thank you, everyone.